All right, can you hear me? All good? Okay, so good morning, everyone. So this is the title of my talk, Don't Say Simply. And it's also actually the conclusion of my talk. So for those of you who are really just here for the key insights, it's on the screen. So for the rest of the half an hour, I'm just going to be talking in probably excessive detail about how I came to this conclusion. And I will start with a story about when I got my first MacBook, entering the Apple world. And when I did, I wanted to install all of the applications which I knew from Windows and from Linux. And I quickly discovered this format called DMG, and it works something like this. So you'll download a file called like steam.dmg, and then you double click on it, and it gives you something that looks like this. It's not Steam, but this thing on the left-hand side, this steam.app, if you double click that, it gives you another window, which is Steam, the thing that you wanted. So there's this weird two-step process, which was a bit weird, but I rolled with it because it worked. And after a while, I got all of my applications, and you can see them here in the Finder in macOS down the left-hand side. So you can see I've got Steam, I've got MySQL Workbench, I've got Google Chrome. It's a bit weird that they're all listed as devices, if you can see that. You don't usually think of Google Chrome as a device, but again, I rolled with it. It did bug me, though, how most of these DMG things have an applications folder inside them. And they don't just contain Steam, they contain a whole bunch of applications. So what's going on there? It was only after several days of working like this that my colleague at the time noticed what I was doing and helpfully informed me that I was doing everything wrong. As it turns out, that applications folder here is actually a link to my global applications folder, where all of my installed applications live. And what I was supposed to be doing is not double-clicking on that thing on the left, even though that works. What you're supposed to do is drag that thing on the left to the thing on the right, and in so doing, you copy the file into your applications folder, installing it. And then after that, what you do is you go back to the Finder and you find this device, this disk image, because it turns out DMG stands for disk image, and then you unmount it, and then you're done. So it's simple, right? It's so simple that the developer who designed this disk image needed to inform me how simple it was with this instruction in the center of the screen. Simply drag. And this is an instruction which I failed to perform. Not just once, but multiple times. Even though it was in the center of the screen, and even though it's just drag and drop. We think of drag and drop as one of the most simple, easy, intuitive actions that you can take on a computer. Here's a baby who's installing Steam on her iPad. And yet, I, as a fully fledged adult working in the software industry, was unable to perform this task. So how is it that I failed at this? What I'm really asking is this disk image format actually simple? Is drag and drop actually simple? And to answer this question, we really need a definition for this word, simple. What is simple? And for this, I've taken inspiration from a talk called Simple Made Easy by Rich Hickey. And in this talk, he makes a distinction between two words which we usually use kind of synonymously, simple and easy. And in his terminology, simple is about having few concepts, having untangled concepts kind of intrinsic to the thing, whereas easiness is about distance. It's about your relationship to the thing, either physical distance at hand or mental distance. He gives some etymology for this, which I don't know how convincing it is. It's not too important. The important thing is that I think this is a useful distinction between the innate concepts in the thing, the simplicity of it, versus ease, which is all about your actions with the object and your familiarity with it. So there's the objective simplicity versus this subjective ease. And yet we don't use this distinction, really, in everyday English. And the reason, I think, is that we mistake ease for simplicity. When we work with something like a program or an installer for days or months or years, we become so familiar with the concepts involved in it that we really forget that we're aware of them at all. It's a bit like, do you know that parable of the fish in water, where you ask a fish, hey, how's the water? And the fish thinks, what the hell is water? Because water is so universal to it that it doesn't need to be aware of that concept even. And I think our software is a bit like that to us. So for example, with these three people here, for this man on the left, installation really means clicking 10 times on a next button in a wizard because he uses Windows. He's aware of all the concepts in Windows installation, but when he thinks about installation, he thinks of the actions, the ease, and he thinks that that's simplicity. For the person on the right, installation is typing. It's typing sudo apt-get install x. Typing might be simple, apt not necessarily simple. And for this person in the middle, drag and drop is how you install. And drag and drop is simple, right? So when she, and I think of her as the designer of this disk image, when she designed this, she helpfully informed me, simply drag, because she was only really aware of the actions involved because she was so familiar and forgot about the concepts. So getting more specific here, what concepts am I actually talking about? What I've tried to draw out here are, in probably too much detail, all of the things that I required in order to use this disk image format successfully. So at the top, you've got the actions, the kind of highly visible things, dragging and dropping, the things that babies can do. And they're kind of the tip of the iceberg, really. Underneath, you have all of these concepts which I required, which kind of motivate the actions and make them have any sense. I needed to understand things like the fact that the disk image is not actually the program. Steam.dmg is not Steam, it's the installer. I needed to understand that installed on macOS means that it's in my applications folder, which is quite a different notion of installation to Linux, say. I needed to understand as well this concept of a link, that this was a link to my applications folder. And I needed to understand that drag and drop copies a file in this context, which is a bit odd, don't you think? Drag and drop doesn't usually perform a copy. But all of these concepts here were never actually explained to me. They were never written down in any of my introduction to Mac OS. They were all implicit in the software that I was using. And so this brings me to my first of 5 reasons to not use the word simply, which is that by using the word simply, you are probably describing actions, violating the terminology that I set out earlier, but you are probably describing actions. Simply do X. And in so doing, I think you're forgetting the concepts that are involved. And I really think we should try to bias ourselves consciously towards those concepts to counteract that cognitive bias that I'm talking about, where we just see the actions. And so here's an example of how I think we could improve this disk image documentation. Instead of saying simply drag, which is really just about the action, we could say something like drag to install, which doesn't explain everything, but it gives you some motivation for that action. It gives you one of the concepts involved. Okay, so a minute ago I conceded for the sake of argument that drag and drop is actually simple or easy. But is it actually? If you Google this, you'll find this question on the Apple Stack Exchange asking how to drag and drop. And the top answer here required a diagram to explain how to drag and drop. So, is it actually simple? Well, for these 39 people, it wasn't. And we can go even further than that, because you'll notice that the first thing that you have to do in drag and drop is clicking. And surely clicking is simple, right? Like, we think of that as an atomic action. But I remember a few years ago when, and this was a little time after I bought my first MacBook, my housemate got his first MacBook. And when it arrived, he excitedly went into his room, went through the beautiful unboxing process, and it was only like 15 minutes later that he comes to me kind of sheepishly and he says, "Hey, Jim, I think my trackpad is broken. Like, how do I click?" And he hands me his laptop and he's hovering over this next button in the macOS setup, and he can't work out how to click it. So how is it that this very smart, soon-to-be lawyer housemate of mine was not able to click the next button on this setup? Well, the reason is that his previous laptop, all his previous laptops, were using Windows. And how do you click on your typical Windows laptop? Well, you have a couple of options. One is that you use the buttons below the trackpad. You'll notice from this picture that there are no buttons because Steve Jobs hated them. Or, second option is that you tap on the trackpad, which is a sort of simulated click in Windows. But if you do that by default on Mac, what does it do? Nothing. And so for the Windows user, for all intents and purposes, this is broken. If you want to make it behave like Windows, you have to turn on this obscure setting here in your trackpad config, which of course is only after the setup. And so this brings me to my second of 5 reasons to not say simply, which is that it is hopelessly subjective. For everything that you think of as simple, there are certainly people who do not think that. This talk is not a rant about Apple. It's a rant about the word simply. But if you'll allow me one more rant about the word about Apple, you might remember the Apple website looking like this. This is back in 2008 when Apple were running this campaign called Get a Mac with the slogan, "It just works." Get a Mac, it just works. But Apple don't use this slogan anymore. And the reason, I think, is because of reactions like this. It just works until it breaks. Or this picture of this ridiculous setup, which is something like we've got over here. When it doesn't just work, people get angry, and when they get angry, they need to lash out, and they do so publicly through Reddit or memes or whatever. So the word just here is behaving a lot like the word simply. It's in a kind of category of what I would say are inflammatory or potentially inflammatory words. Simply, just, of course, trivially. My personal favorite here is, and I don't know if you've seen this one, boom, you're done. And when I see this, I think, well, no, boom, my computer just blew up, and now what do I do? I'm not done. So my third of 5 reasons to not use the word simply is that by using this word, you are making people angry, and worse, you're making people ashamed. When I don't have that same experience of simplicity that you claimed that I would, I get angry. And when there's no one to kind of take that anger out on, I can't shout at you, the author. I tend to turn that anger internally, and it must be me, right? I must be stupid that I haven't been able to accomplish this simple task. So here's another possibly excessive way to fix this disk image documentation. Instead of saying simply drag, how about something placating like not working, talk to us with a link. And what you're doing here is admitting the possibility of failure. You're not saying that it will fail, but you're admitting that possibility. And more importantly, what you're saying is, in that case, it's not your fault. So I've been talking about these examples in the Apple world, but it goes so much further, deep, I think, into our developer culture. And here you can see, I don't know if you can really read these, but I did a search for the word simply on GitHub, and these are some random examples. I'm not going to read them all out. I'll read one of them out. It's this one in the bottom left. Rolling the week of the year can have seemingly strange effects, simply because the year of the week of year may be different from the calendar year. And I don't know about you, but this one makes my head spin. If you want more examples, do a search for it. There are 92 million more examples. So, as developers, I think we are infatuated with this word, simply. You can see here the frequency of the word simply. On the left, you can see this in English, so the frequency of the word in casual English conversation. And on the right, the rightmost 3, you can see the frequency of the word in 3 popular software projects, TensorFlow, React, Laravel. And you'll notice that they all use the word more frequently than in English, even though they are talking about things which ostensibly we would think of as quite complex, certainly more so than the average thing that you talk about in an English conversation. This one on the right, Laravel, really stands out, and I'll come back to that in a minute. This brings me to my 4th reason to not say simply, which is that it is overused, it is lazy, it's unimaginative. If you really want to use the word simply, there is almost certainly something better you can use. So let's think about that. What can you do that's better? Well, one option is to focus on complexity. If you have one thing here that you think is simple, another thing here that you think is complex, focus on this one. Why do you think this is complex? Describe the complexity. Or similarly, describe the difficulty. If there's something coming up which is especially difficult or tricky, flag that up. This is an example from Jekyll sitemap, which is a Ruby gem that I use in my blog. But in the README, it says, be sure to require Jekyll sitemap either after those other gems if you want the sitemap to include the generated content, or before those other gems if you don't want the sitemap to include the generated content from the gems. programming is hard. And when I read this, programming is hard, I think, yeah, programming is hard. Like, I've experienced this. There's kind of a bond here, like he's being honest with me. And so here's another possibly excessive way that you could fix this disk image. Brew some coffee, then drag. Don't use it in this example, but the point here is that you are flagging up something that might be especially difficult. Another option that you can take here to replace the word simply is to be more specific. Why do you think this thing is simple? Perhaps you think it's simple because you think it's small. If so, say so. Perhaps you think it's simple because it's quick to set up. If so, say so. Better yet, be comparative. When you say small, smaller than what? Like smaller than jQuery, maybe. That's a useful comment. Or quicker to set up than TensorFlow. That's a lot more helpful to me than simple. Better yet, you can frequently measure the thing that you think of as simple, and so you can be absolute here. Like, what do you mean by small? If you think that this thing doesn't require many lines of code, well, how many does it require? Tell me. Like, it requires 5 lines of code. Or if you think your product is quick to set up, then how long does it take? Tell me. It takes 3 minutes to set up. You'll notice that I've put this one in red, and it's because I think that there is a trap here. But even better than that, I think, is to kind of show rather than tell. Instead of telling me this thing requires 5 lines of code, show me what they are. Or if you think that your product takes 3 minutes to set up, instead of telling me that, you can prove that to me. Like, show me, like make a walkthrough video. How do I set it up? And so I work for this company, Pusher, and I noticed on our website last year that it said this. It says, be up and running with Pusher in 3 minutes. And when I saw this, I thought, okay, I'll take my previous advice. Let's make a walkthrough video. Let's prove to people, the readers, that they can get up and running with Pusher in 3 minutes. So I tried it. I made the video. How long do you think the video was? It's 8 minutes and 27 seconds. So I work for the company. I work on the product. I'm intimately familiar with this product. And yet it took me almost 3 times as long to set up this product as we claimed that it would for a member of the public. I later changed this to 10 minutes. I still think that's pushing it. There are definitely better ways to approach this. Here's one from the AngularJS tutorial that I like. Says you can go through the whole tutorial in a couple of hours, or you may want to spend a pleasant day really digging into it. And I don't know how pleasant that day would be, but I do think that this is certainly a lot more honest than if it had said, you can get started with Angular in 3 minutes. So I've given you some ways that you can replace the word simply, but if none of those really apply, then remove the word. And these are all the examples from earlier where I just removed the word simply. And in every case, I think, it's shorter, it's crisper, it's more honest, it's still grammatically correct. And so this brings me to my 5th reason to not say simply, which is that the word is filler text. If it doesn't provide any information, then get rid of it. For those of you with no imagination, that's what this would look like on disk image. All right, so armed with this newfound insight of mine that the word simply was always bad, I did what every good engineer should do to fix the problem, and I created a script to fix it. And if you go to this URL, you can find that script. What it does is, if you run it and give it the name of a repository on GitHub, it will check it out, it will remove the word simply in all cases, and it will open a pull request with this explanation here. And I was quite pleased with this. So I started using it on some public projects. This is Laravel, where it was fairly positively appreciated, I think, and they merged it. I removed around 100 words from there, severely reducing that bar that you saw earlier in that chart. But in all cases, it didn't work so well. So here is one where this really kind of backfired. And I tried to use the same approach on the Redis documentation. So Redis is this in-memory database, which is pretty popular. We use it extensively at Pusher. And Antiras, the owner or the author of Redis and the documentation, said to me that he found my pull request fairly unhelpful, that actually he uses the word simply in quite a different sense to mean only or solely, that there's nothing else left to do. And it's kind of a meaning that I had not considered. But more importantly, what Antiras pointed out to me was that not only was my pull request unhelpful, but he actually found it offensive that I was dictating to other people how to write their own text based on my personal beliefs. And after this, I felt quite bad. This guy I've followed for years, I respect him. He's kind of integral to our business as well at Pusher. And where did I go wrong? Where was I offending him? And it was only after a while that I realized that this pull request may as well have said this. Simply don't say simply. There is nothing less empathetic than a script running against words that you have carefully written, deleting them, and telling you that you were wrong to have ever written them in the first place. I had talked about shame, about shaming your readers by using the word simply, and that's why you should avoid it. Yet, here I was with this script shaming writers, and not just shaming them, but automating the shaming of writers. And actually, that's what I've been doing for the last half an hour, so for all of the authors of these anonymous quotes, I'm sorry. I think Antiras was right here, that it's not as simple as just removing the word simply or any other words. You really need to evaluate in context. You need to understand the meaning of the words. You need to understand your audience. And more than that, you really need to enact a kind of attitude shift towards your audience, one of kind of empathy or sympathy. And for that, you don't need a script, you need humans. We need humans. This is the inevitable hiring slide. So at Pusher, I would really like to hire some technical writers, documentarians to help us work on problems like this, but so many others, problems that you will probably identify on the job that I haven't spotted because I'm not an expert in this. We are hiring, we're expanding, it's exciting. We're in London. If it's of any interest to you, maybe drop us an email. It's jim@pusher.com is my email. If that doesn't work for you, then I hope that you just take away from this talk the title, really. Don't say simply. I do think it's a pretty good rule. Maybe take it with a pinch of salt. Tell your friends. That's all I've got. Thanks.